Hello, grade 8. In this chapter, we're going to address the concept of force and work. Now, in order to do a job in the universe, you have to apply two things: force, work, and energy. Energy is not going to be discussed here. However, we're going to discuss what is force and what does it do to an object, and what is the difference between force, work, and power. First of all, we're gonna start by defining force. Force is basically responsible for the actions you see between any two objects. If you're gonna define a force, well, basically, when an object change position, shape, that's basically how you can define force. Now, we cannot see or touch force, but we can see its effect on objects. So, whenever an object moves, or whenever an object stopped moving, or whenever an object changed shape, we say force has acted on it. Therefore, force is defined by a change in position in an object, push or pull, or a change in shape. Now, the change in shape is basically a push and pull on an object. However, it sometimes helps to define them differently. Moving of an object or change shape of an object is basically defined as force. Now, in order to make things easy, we can divide forces based on how they act on an object. First type or first group of forces need to have the objects touching each other to have an effect. These are called contact forces. Other forces don't need to be directly in contact with the object to have an effect. These are called non-contact forces. So the difference is some forces have to have object touching to have an effect. Other forces don't need that. They can act on an object from a far distance. Now, this is basically it. Contact forces, they need the object to be physically touching each other. Now, first type is reaction force. Reaction force is basically applied on any object on planet Earth and other planets for that matter. It's the force that basically opposes gravity force. Now, later on, we're going to see there's a forces pulling an object down. Well, an opposite to that force is another force called reaction force, or sometimes called normal force or opposite force. Nonetheless, any object, be it moving or not moving, has what we call a reaction force acting on it. And for this reaction force to happen, two objects has to be, for example, resting on something. Nonetheless, this force acts on objects regardless if they're moving or not. Now, for example, this is a reaction force. You can see the box resting on a table. Now, this downward force will be later explained as gravity force. It always pulls down to the center of Earth, while the reaction force actually opposes the motion of or the acting force of gravity. That's why if there's no gravity, this object would likely move up rather than down. Now, a contact force that is also very common in our life is tension. Tension is basically when you pull down on something, on a mass pulling down on a rope, or for example, pulling your hair or stretching a cord. That force is called a tension force when you pull it. Okay, so you can define tension as one object stretched and has to be stretched by another object in a different direction. Notice this mass is pulling down. Tension in the rope likes to not to be pulled down, so it has the opposite direction. Now, note that when we represent forces, we represent them using arrows. The arrows shows the direction of the force, whether it's left, right, up and down. Now, the length of the arrow actually shows you the amount of force working on an object. So if one arrow is longer than the other, that means this is a bigger force than the other force represented by a shorter arrow. Move on. Friction. Now, friction is a very famous force. It acts on any two objects in contact with each other. Friction always opposes the direction of motion. So if this box is moving down, friction works on the opposite direction. Now, friction is an important force because it can be very good for you or very bad for you, depending on what is your purpose by doing or applying force on an object. However, whenever two objects are touching, one force to be considered is friction. Now, if you're asking yourself this question, is there a limited amount of forces working object? The answer is not really. For any object moving, there's a group of forces working on it, not just one force. And it happened to be at least 3 forces working on an object if it's moving or even if it's not moving. So at any time, yes, there is more than one force working on an object. Now, air resistance is another type of force. Now, note that these forces that we have talking about happen to happen between objects that are touching each other, so they are called contact forces. Has to be in touch with another object so it can have an effect. Now, air resistance. Air resistance is when an object actually hits air particles. Now, let's say it's a falling object, not a flying object. A flying object is a little bit a different story. Now, a falling object will have air particles hitting it. Now, when they hit it, they try to push it a little bit up. They don't want it to move down, they just want it to move up. Now, this is pretty much like friction. It opposes them, or actually you can call it air friction, but since it's air, we call it air resistance because it also resists the direction of pull of gravity. Air resistance or air friction is basically a force that allows or prevents an object from falling at full speed down to earth. Now, many animals, like birds, take advantage of air resistance to fly, and also we build planes, flying planes, taking in consideration that there is air resistance to help it fly. Now, this is a contact force. So if the air particles do not touch the object, there is no air resistance, and the object will simply fall based on the pull of gravity. Now, non-contact forces are forces that can be working on an object, but they don't have to be touching. This is the topic we're gonna address in the next video. For now, goodbye, and be sure to send your questions if you have any.